I'll be brief in the introduction because you've already seen it in the invitation. The subject of tonight's talk is also the title of Joseph Braude's new book, Broadcasting Change, Arabic Media as a Catalyst for Liberalism. And as you know, there are copies available out on the table outside. What impressed me to no end, aside from my having had the pleasure some years ago of hearing Joseph speak and was deeply impressed by what I heard and learned from him, is the review he got from the person I happen to think is the finest Arab journalist and who was the manager of Al Arabiya television for quite a few years, and that is Abdul Rahman al-Rashid. And here is what he said about Dr. Braude's new book. Quote, "In the Middle East, where literacy rates are low and public awareness is minimal, the influence of television and social media can be a life and death matter. As Joseph Braude argues in this groundbreaking book, media can play a crucial role in countering extremism, challenging entrenched ideas, and bridging distances. Braude's expertise in the Arab language and his history of deep involvement in the Arab world make him ideally suited to investigate both the problems and the promise of this field," unquote. I don't think you could get a better review than that, Joseph. As again, if you've read the intro, Joseph Braude is fluent in not only Arabic, but Farsi and Hebrew, and English, I should add. He's written a number of books that show his adventuresome spirit, including one about Iraq, and we were just sharing experiences from the spring of 2003 when he went there to see if he might be able to start a newspaper. And indeed, he wrote a book, The New Iraq, on what he saw. He also wrote a book of his experiences in Morocco, which were quite extraordinary, when he embedded with the police on a murder case. So this just gives you some indication of the depth of his experience, and that is called The Honored Dead. Joseph is widely published in a number of newspapers and magazines. He has left us, or he will be leaving us with a takeaway policy sheet that is available out where the book is. I didn't want anyone fanning themselves with it during the talk, so I didn't put it in your seats, but I encourage you to take a copy of that. And I'm going to leave my brief introduction of Joseph here because he's written some notes on the back that he needs to use. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Braude.
I'm going to bring you some good news and some bad news. The good news is that amidst the hardships and the partisan polarization taking the form of sectarian difference and intolerance in so many countries in the Middle East, there is a rising trend, particularly among young people, who want to transcend the identities that divide them. The bad news is that they're still outnumbered by some very nimble and effective actors who have been brainwashed by generations of extremist propaganda. And that conflict is a tough one for liberals. This good news and bad news was sort of nicely encapsulated by an Iraqi comedian who has a TV show. It's called The Bashir Show, and it's one of several knockoffs of Jon Stewart's The Daily Show that have become popular across the Middle East. So I thought, in the spirit of levity, but also because it really speaks to the situation, I would share that clip with you now.
والله نكمل بيه الحلقة فيديو واحد يحكي لنا فيه على الوحدة الوطنية، على وحدة الأديان.
نحن أبناء هذا البلد لنتنصل عن هذه المسميات. أبناء هذا البلد، أنا عراقي وأنت عراقي.
ألف رحمة على والديك، إيش قد شريف وخير وآدمي. فعلا هذا ما نحتاجه، التنصل عن هالمسميات.
إذا صار الشيعة والسنة الأمور واضحة، يعني خلي يفهم الجميع أنه من الغالب إذا صار الشيعة والسنة. أنتم تشكلون 15% وإحنا نشكل 85%.
15%؟ 85%؟
هذه خارطة العراق بمحافظاته. طيب لو أردنا أن نقول أن هناك سنة وشيعة، فعند ذلك ستكون الخارطة بهذا الشكل أن هناك سنة بهذا الامتداد يكون.
ما راح أقول لك أبرم هاي الورقة وتعرف وين تحطها، أو راح أقول لك أبرم هاي الورقة وحطها بجيبك. وآخر شيء، احنا هم جبنا خريطة خاصة بينا ووزعنا بيها النسب حسب المناطق اللي ساكنين بها العراقيين. طلعت ويانا هاي، ما طلع ويانا ذا.
Now, when outsiders who look at the situation in Iraq, including specialists in Iraq, are asked to diagnose the challenge of establishing stability and security in the country, they often speak in terms of military and violent actors, Iranian proxy militias, the role of Sunni jihadists, and so on. But for many Iraqis, the problem begins between the ears of that young man who spoke about the 85% and the 15%. He is someone who speaks blissfully unaware of how he is contradicting himself, perhaps because he was denied the tools of critical thinking that he would need to pick apart the contradiction in his argument in the Iraqi school system. And if you're Iraqi, you recognize that personality, because someone like him may be teaching your child in school, he may be deciding whether to grant a license for your business in a government ministry, and he would be staffing the police in many parts of the country, and alas, he may have a seat at the table of senior decision-making levels of government. And so the question of how to positively influence that mindset and enrich it with the tools that would help that young man reason his way through the question of how to truly establish unity in Iraq, transcend sectarian division, goes to the heart of the problems that Iraq is facing today, and a problem that is much broader. Now, that problem is exacerbated by the fact that for every one show like the Bashir show, there are many satellite channels that are preaching violence and hate and seeking to indoctrinate the population and tweak the culture in a manner that suits their agenda. And so it would be necessary, alas, to ground you in a flavor for what those channels are like too. And to be an equal opportunity exposer, I'm going to show you a Shiite clip followed by a Sunni one. The first being one of the many channels that is controlled by an Iranian government-backed militia, again in Iraq. It's called Al-Ahad, and it belongs to the Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq militia, which is one of the subsidiaries of the Popular Mobilization Forces. And here, it's not the typical type of clip in which he is, a given cleric is railing against the sectarian other, but one in which the cleric Muhammad as-Safi has chosen the target of Valentine's Day. And we're going to look at what he has to say about Valentine's Day and then consider the larger meaning of his effort here.
فتلقى ضحايا اليوم يحتفلون كثير من الناس المسلمين ومن شيعة أهل البيت في مثل هيك يوم بعيد الحب. هذا منو جابه؟ منو زرع هذا الزرع؟ منو خلى هاي البذرة؟ منو خلى الإنسان اليوم ما قاعد يباوع للحدود الشرعية من جهة وللحدود الاجتماعية من جهة؟ هذا طبعا مشكلة، المجتمع لازم يتحرك. بس نبدأ من اليوم إن شاء الله تعالى، إن شاء الله نفلش هذا عيد الحب إن شاء الله تعالى. إن شاء الله ما يستمر عيد الحب هذا ما دام هذا المنبر موجود والناس الشرفاء موجودة والناس الأحرار موجودة والناس بوعي ودين وثقافة وتنتبه. إن شاء الله هذا عيد الحب ما يستمر إن شاء الله. صيحوا بأعلى أصواتكم لبيك يا حسين.
And here is iPhone footage that I managed to find of an attack on a Valentine's Day celebration in Najaf, hours after that sermon was delivered. An attack, one of the least bloody attacks ordered by that station, to be sure. A few people were roughed up. Several hundred balloons were popped. But the larger target is a celebration of love, something that is seen by the cleric to be a foreign imposition or implantation. And this action that the cleric took, using this very powerful platform of television, was an effort, a successful one, to impose a new taboo on Iraq by way of his hold over the popular imagination among his followers. And tweaking the culture is an ongoing pursuit of all of these actors. There's also a feeding frenzy among Islamist extremist elements of the two sects, such that the 24-hour incitement against Sunnis, in addition to the reality of Iranian let's call it political hegemony in Iraq, spawns pent-up demand for a response, an equally vehement and visceral response. Call it a cycle of incitement. And one of the many channels that is doing that kind of work on behalf of Sunni jihadists is called Wisal TV. And thought I'd show you a little poetry that comes out of Wisal.
بغداد واصحوا هل بكم رجل حكيم التشيع بذرة الكافر ابن سبع اليهودي قد دفنها برض فارس انتقاما من جدودي كبرت وقامت تسلق خبثة تتعدى الحدودي من كلامكم ثمرها عاش في حزب الرجيم وكيف يعطى الخمس للحاخام لعتل زنيم. يا عرب إيران تطعن طعن أعراض محمد لو بكم رجل غيور الدم بعروقه تجمد انهضوا والشرك زايل والله إلا أن يخمد موعد لله ما يخلف على بيض الرقيم. يا عرب إيران تبغى ذلكم حقد وثار. يا عرب إيران تبغى تبدل الإسلام نار. يا عرب إيران تبغى داركم دار البوار. شوفوا القتل المنظم في شوارعكم ضريم. يا عرب بغداد صارت فارسية يا نيام. شوفوا السستاني ما يفقه عروبي الكلام.
Now, it was heartening in 2014 when the Saudi government evicted Wisal from Saudi territory. The voice you heard is a Saudi preacher, and the channel is a kind of a joint venture, a lot of Kuwaiti funding, and quite a bit of Saudi staff. It was also evicted from Bahrain and eventually from Kuwait. This is a channel that literally has blood on its hands. It was fingered by the Bahraini Independent Commission of Inquiry for having directly incited some of the killing in Bahrain in 2011, and also attacks on Shiite mosques in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have been sourced to orders issued on this channel. The problem is, again, a matter of public attitude, because 2 years later, in 2016, a well-intentioned member of the Saudi Majlis Shura, the Consultative Council, tweeted a tweet that he hoped would encourage more shutdowns of channels like Wisal by trying to elicit a show of public support. And so this is a sort of an online poll on Twitter in which he asks, in light of the fact that the Wisal channel incites internecine sectarian strife and serves a partisan agenda that is sometimes in tune with ISIS, do you support its having been closed? Nearly 25,000 people responded to the poll. 18% said yes, they support it having been closed. 82% said that they were opposed to its closure. Now, I think that some caveats are in order here. First of all, since we note that the TV station's Twitter presence gets a mention on the tweet, it's clear that Wisal was aware of the poll. Probably they used their formidable social media presence to engineer a get out the vote, which would have skewed the result. Nonetheless, apparently they had who would get out that vote. And meanwhile, if there ought to have been a liberal cadre that would launch its own get out the vote drive in order to send a message, but it did not make its presence felt in this poll. And so the question comes back to a matter of popular culture and popular sensibilities. And so the question that returns to the aspiration expressed by the Iraqi comic of transcending divisions based on identity is, how do you get from that vaguely espoused sentiment to an actual change in the culture? Now, 49 years ago, a remarkable man far from Iraq and Saudi Arabia in North Africa set out to do just that. It's the Tunisian strongman Al-Habib Bourguiba, whom I have in mind, the liberator of Tunisia from France and a dictator who sought to bring some liberal values or sensibilities to a conservative population. And there was a memorable moment in Libya, right after Libya's Muammar al-Gaddafi had taken power in the last in a long chain of Nasserist coups, when Bourguiba put into words what he called the alternative Arabism, an alternative vision of the nationalism that he believed in. And here's how he expressed it.
هو نفسه العقيد قذافي مثل حصل ما تخلي في اتحاد مثل حصل مع سوريا ومصر والسودان فينه الله اعلم فين سوريا ماشيه الجهه بتاع السودان ماشي الجهه بتاع حصل مناوي فهمت والشعوب ما تتوحد الا ما تتغير الادمغه وتتجه نحو توسيع معنى الوطنيه. أنا نحب نبني الشيء على الصحة، على الدماغ، على البشر، بالوطنية العربية اللي نؤمن بها ونحب نكونها، نحب نبنيها على تغيير تفكير العرب، تفكير جديد غير التفكير الضيق اللي إلى الآن ما زال موجود.
Now the reason why I feel it's worth subtitling and sharing that decades-old clip is not because he said what he said, but because he acted on it. Say what you will about Tunisia under Bourguiba and his successor Bin Ali, who was deposed in the first of the Arab Spring revolutions. They were brutal, they were corrupt, and so on. But they were also people who consistently pursued a cultural agenda which took the form of education in schools, an overhaul of religious instruction, and consistent media work to promote a certain set of ideals, which included women's equality and empowerment, ideas about tolerance, and a range of other essentials for the development of a democratic society. Such that when in 2015, 4 Tunisians were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their role in holding together the frail and ongoing democratic experiment in the country, at this point the only ongoing Arab Spring democratic experiment. A lot of observers in Tunisia said that this was somehow, in a sense, Bourguiba's legacy, that the presence of a strong labor constituency in Tunisia capable of organizing and acting against Islamist impositions, the presence of a strong network of women's movements, organizations capable of pushing back against efforts to roll back their rights, would not have happened but for the groundwork that was painstakingly laid for that within the culture. So if you are a liberal today in the Arab world or in any number of Arab countries, and you're looking at the bitter legacy of the post-Arab Spring experiments, you have, in attempting to draw up your own plans, as they say in Arabic, khiyaran ahlaha mur, 2 choices, the sweeter of which is bitter. You can adopt the revolutionary position, more revolutions, and face the likelihood that, like so many of the recent revolutions, it will lead to more chaos, more violence, that even if there are elections, those elections may only calcify communal divisions or consecrate an extremist ideology or coronate a strong man. Or, and this is no fun, you can look for an environment in which a new leader has begun to speak the language of Bourguiba and attempt to hold him to it, to enter a relationship with the system, to contribute your ideas and energies to that new experiment, and to push against the limits and the red lines that have been imposed on you by that autocratic establishment. I wrote this book because I've spent a lot of time in the region looking for opportunities to promote liberalism, or I should say opportunities that local actors have found to advance their liberal agenda, and the question of how to help them do their work more effectively. There are leaders in the region today who, at the very least, are speaking a Bourguiba-like language. Before we evaluate the genuineness and the staying power of their stated commitments, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to watch one. Here is the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, speaking about the role of media in inculcating the ideals that he says he would like to pursue. Bear in mind the Bourguiba statement you just saw when you watch this.
أنا شايف إن دور الإعلام دور هيبقى حاكم جدا لإعادة اصطفاف المصريين. في عندنا إشكالية في الخطاب الديني. إشكالية كبيرة جدا جدا جدا. دي عاملة تسببت في إن إحنا مش قادرين نتحرك لقدام بشكل مريح ومناسب. الوعي كمان محتاج شغل. وعي المصريين بيتشكل في تقديري في الأسرة وفي دور العبادة وفي المدرسة وبالإعلام. والإعلام قد يكون هو الأهم دلوقتي أكتر من أي حاجة تانية. لازم نعترف إن مفيش استراتيجية عالمية ولا سياسة عالمية. يمكن كتير من حضراتكم ما يتصورش إن النقطة دي نقطة مهمة في حوارنا اللي احنا بنتكلم فيه. لكن أنا بصراحة شايفها إنها مشكلة حقيقية لازم نشتغل عليها. لازم مش الإعلام بس، ده مؤسسات الدولة كلها بالكامل لازم تتحرك عشان تعيد النسيج المصري.
That is a gathering of leading establishment media in Egypt whom Sisi convened as a presidential candidate shortly after the ouster of Mohamed Morsi. And a lot of people, many liberals at the time, were supportive of Sisi, and that kind of talk is what gave them their grounds for optimism. And all over the world, Arab world, I think people were looking to see whether Sisi would act on these ideas. Now, why did he focus on media when he mentioned also religious establishment, schools, the family? If you watch the extended clip, he explains his rationale. It is not easy to reimagine the type of control over the flow of information and indoctrination that a Bourguiba would have been able to achieve 50 years ago. And media, in an environment where the school system is sclerotic, the religious establishment is exceptionally rigid, is the most fluid and dynamic tool of inculcation. It is also the venue that you can use to skip across borders and reach into parts of Egypt and parts of the broader region where it's not possible to deploy a cultural initiative on the ground due to the instability. So media indeed has a special role to play. Can a state come together and partner with motivated actors within its own society to begin to inculcate a constructive message in a systemic way? We'll come back to the question of Egypt a little bit later, but I'm going to say a few words about Morocco in order to provide a sterling example of where the answer might be yes. In that country, after triple suicide bombings in Casablanca in 2003, a newly minted king, taken over in 1999 from his father, pledged to pursue a holistic strategy to roll back extremist ideologies in his borders through a security clampdown on mosque indoctrination, through economic initiatives, through schools, and indeed through the media. He had in his corner a very strong and promising institutional capacity in his Ministry of Islamic Affairs, where the reigning reading of Islam is one that rather seamlessly links Moroccan nationalism, or I should say the royalist idea about Moroccan nationalism, with the experience of religion. It has Sufi traditions that are recognized, a kind of a quietist mystical strand, and other very useful religious teachings and tropes that can help challenge an extremist ideology. So when he set out to launch a media campaign to counter the likes of the religious broadcasting we saw earlier this evening, he took 12 really talented people from the Islamic Affairs Ministry and sent them to France for various types of training and creative role playing over the space of a year to begin to conceive of a satellite channel of his own, a religious affairs channel that could be some kind of an antidote to the likes of the jihadist and Shiite Islamist programming you saw earlier. They did it by way of focusing on certain themes, reclaiming a sense of place, that is, Morocco, its cities, a sense of a unified Moroccan destiny that is independent of any trans-state ideology. Reclaiming what is peculiar and special about the experience of Islam in Morocco, its distinctive style of Quran recitation, the accent, the Sufi traditions. The role of women would become a prominent theme in this broadcast. And the role of the family in speaking to young people who are being urged by extremists to detach themselves from family. This would be a broadcast that asked the family to come together around Islam. One little illustrative example of what came out of this effort is a program loosely based on American Idol, but for Quranic chanting, and at that, Quranic chanting by Moroccan girls. And as you'll see from this clip, which ties together those themes that I just mentioned, it's really not about the competition.
أما المشاركات مشاهدي الكرام، مشاهداتنا الكريمات الذين يشاركن في هذه الحلقة فهن فاطمة الزهراء جاليزين مدينة مكناس، أهلا وسهلا. كذلك مريم فايد مدينة طنجة، مرحبا بك. وعلى بركة الله ننطلق مع أول متسابقة، نبدأ بمدينة طنجة. تفضلي مريم فايد، تفضلي الكرسي ديال القراءة وشوفي الجلسة ديالك المناسبة اللي غادة ترتاحي فيها إن شاء الله. الآيات التي تقرأينها هي من اختيار ديالك.
إن شاء الله سأقرأ ما تيسر من سورة فاطر. إن الله عالم غيب السماوات والأرض إنه عليم بذات الصدور صدق الله العظيم.
صدق الله العظيم. شكرا بنتي مريم. قبل ما إذا سمحتوا لي نسول مريم شحال كم تحفظين من القرآن الكريم؟
حاملة لكتاب الله تعالى.
حاملة لكتاب الله عز وجل. تفضلوا أساتذة منسق ديال الجناء أولا الأستاذ الكبير الحديدي.
كلما ننظر إلى طفل أو إلى بنت تحمل القرآن الكريم في سن كسن مريم إلا ونتخيل من ورائها أما أو أبا يعني بدلوا المجهود ديالهم وسهروا.
وهذا شأن الوالدين كاملين. راه المشاركات معنا كلهم جابوهم والديهم فرحانين بهم فيما مشاو كيمشوا معهم. كاين عمل الله يجزيهم بخير الوالدين.
حقيقة هذه هي الرسالة التي يجب أن يفهمها كل أب وكل أم.
So this colorful and charming little program encapsulates the theme of the family, the theme of locality, the theme of girls, and the need to make them prominent. I might add that another interesting contrast between this clip and what you saw of the Shiite and Sunni extremist television is that it's not built around a cult of personality. It's not a single figure telling you what to do and how to think. Who is at the center of this? There's a panel of judges, there's a host, they're all standing aside so that young ladies can show off their talents. There's an institution here. Nor are they reacting to extremist preaching by inciting back the way that the two faiths are inciting at each other in a cycle of mutual exacerbation. They are ignoring those messages in a sense and telling their own story on their own terms. So this is a remarkable achievement, and it's extremely popular in Morocco, together with its radio sister broadcast. It's the kind of thing that happens when you have a strong state institution backing the venture. It's not easy for 3 or 4 people to get together and create a channel like this, even with unlimited funds. There are other countries where liberally motivated actors have successfully engaged the state in efforts not necessarily of a religious nature, but in sort of reaching outside of the religious discussion to talk about women's issues and other matters through comedy and entertainment. Saudi public television has been a venue for a remarkable program. It had a 17-year run that at a much darker time in Saudi Arabia was subtly challenging clerical hegemony over the public space in that kingdom. The program was called Tash Matash, which roughly translates to you either get it or you don't. And I think you're all going to get the meaning of this clip. A very short skit about what's that?
It's brilliant.
Yeah, it is a great show, was a great show. What happens when a policeman and his sidekick respond to a call about a possible robbery?
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
فيه بلاغ مقدم من عندكم؟
اي في بلاغ والحرامي جوا يلا.
إيه في حرامي عندك؟
إيه.
إيه. بس يلا 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 اسم الظهري طيب الظهري. عندك ساقة زك. تعال في ساقة. عفوا بغيت أسأل فين أبوكم؟
يا ولادي ابونا ما هو موجود، مسافر.
ما نقدر ندخل البيت من غير رجال. قسم بالله إن ودي أخدمكم في عيوني هذه، لكن ما نقدر ندخل بدون محرم.
مو صادق والله ما قال الا الصدق.
هيا في امان الله.
خلفتنا العافيه ستر عليكم.
ستر عليك.
ستر عليكم.
By contemporary Saudi standards, this is a fairly gentle comedy skit. But in its time, I think about 13 years ago, this was so controversial that it barely made its way onto the airwaves, and it inspired death threats to everyone who was involved in the writing and production of this skit. And it wasn't the only one of its kind. This program was relentless. A book has since been written called The Battles of Tash Matash, about the struggle within the information ministry in Saudi Arabia. At one point, for every 10 skits that the writers submitted to censors, 4 would be rejected. But over time, through persistence, they managed to work the censors over, to challenge, to be persistent, and things that were once forbidden would later be resubmitted and accepted. And in retrospect, over this remarkable 18 months in which Saudi Arabia has seen rescinding of the ban on women's driving, the stripping of the authority of the religious police to make arrests, now the advent of the cinema in Saudi Arabia and other social reforms that have been welcomed by the population, women in particular credit this program with having nudged the public discussion forward, with having challenged ingrained ideas by exposing them to ridicule. It was one of many initiatives that were happening on Saudi Arabia in the media for certainly the past 13 years. Another way that liberals in Saudi Arabia sought to use media was through the news, and turning news into a series of teachable moments, and turning news analysis into a kind of liberal exhortation. When a decision would be made by the royal family, which in liberals' judgment was a positive step, they would seek to build on it, push on it, and try to urge the public to call for more such reforms. One example was in 2014, when the late King Abdullah instituted, this was at the time when the Muslim Brotherhood was determined to be designated a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia and other countries. He ordered surveillance of teachers and who might be indoctrinating for the Brotherhood in the sanctity of their relationship with school children. Mansour Ngaidan, who is formerly a hardline religious leader himself and who evolved over time into a prominent liberal actor in Saudi Arabia, was asked to comment on this new decision. And watch him describe his views, watch him push beyond the Brotherhood to talk about other groups that he would also like to see in the kingdom's sights, and push beyond targeting an enemy to advocating for an alternative reading, alternative set of ideas about what it means to be Saudi.
معي من الرياض الكاتب الصحفي منصور الانقيدان. يعني أهمية تطبيق مثل هذا القرار اليوم في هذه الفترة في المدارس سيد منصور.
هي تأخرت قرابة 3 عقود هذه الخطوة، لكنها بالتأكيد هي خطوة مهمة جدا في طريق طويل سيكون مليئا بالعقبات، مليئا بالمعاناة، مليئا بالآلام، مليئا بالكثير من التضحيات. وأتمنى وكما أتمنى أيضا أن يتساوق هذا القرار أيضا بتوعية أكثر بالانفتاح نحو الآخر، أن يصل الوعي إلى كل شاب وإلى كل طالب وإلى كل شاب سعودي إلى أن أخاك في الوطن الذي يقبع في المنطقة الشرقية في القطيف أو الأحساء من الشيعة أو في المدينة هو أخوه في الوطن، وعليه أن يكون أقرب إليه من إخوان المسلمين الذين هم في الحقيقة هم الخطر الحقيقي على الوطن وعلى سلمه.
هل تتوقع بالفعل أنه في تغلغل في داخل المدارس لنشر مثل هذه الأفكار؟
هو تغلغل الإخوان المسلمين وتغلغل الإسلام السياسي وتغلغل الفكر القاعدي والجهادي هو عميق جدا مع الأسف الشديد، وقد ضرب بجذوره منذ عقود طويلة، ولكن الحمد لله أنها الآن صحونا واستيقظنا. يبقى أيضا أن جميع المؤسسات الحكومية في التربية والتعليم أيضا، وفي التعليم العالي أيضا، وفي وزارة الشؤون الإسلامية والأوقاف والدعوة والإرشاد لابد أن تطلع بمسؤولية وتتحمل مسؤوليتها.
That was also a gutsy statement to make in 2014. It's still a little ahead of its time in Saudi Arabia, but progress that has been made since this period in the Saudi discussion of what it means to be a Saudi nationalist, the notion of a more inclusive Saudi identity that recognizes the Shiite minority as a legitimate an authentic faith-based community, testify to certainly the acknowledgement of the importance of this approach if you're trying to hold the country together, and the pent-up demand among liberally minded Saudis for these ideals. The examples I've shown you just now all relate in some way to a state institution, whether it be the Moroccan Ministry of Islamic Affairs, Saudi Public Television, a semi-government venture, which is Al Arabiya, or I should say not controlled by the government, but dominated by the royal family of Saudi Arabia. There are also independent initiatives that happen without the blessing of a given government, by liberals who seek to introduce new ideas that they don't believe their government will readily propagate itself, but in bringing them via the internet and through other means, bend over backwards to avoid crossing the government in hopes that over time they can build support for their ideas and see it find a way into government. And so this is where we will return to Egypt and encounter a young man named Islam Hussein, who is part of a team of a group of people called Tahrir Academy, who do online learning to try to pioneer new types of curricula that they hope will eventually be embraced by Egyptian schools. Earlier, we talked about critical thinking and the idea that all kinds of dramatic irony and internal contradiction could be obviated if young people were exposed to the tools of critical thinking to reason their way through disputes and hatred. So one learning module on Tahrir Academy intended to instill critical thinking in viewers. So I thought I'd give you a little flavor for that as well.
العالم بيتغير من حوالينا بسرعة الصاروخ. هل طريقة تفكيرنا بتتغير بسرعة موازية تخلينا نواكب التغيير في نوع ودرجة تعقيد المشاكل اللي بتقابلنا كل يوم؟ للأسف لا، لأننا بننشأ بطريقة تخلينا نتعامل مع المشاكل بأسلوب تقليدي. اتعلمنا حاجة وبنفضل نكررها ونعيدها تاني. الواقع اللي حوالينا بيقول إن قواعد اللعبة اتغيرت. المشاكل اللي بتقابلنا بتحتاج حلول أكثر ابتكارا، يعني حلول من خارج الصندوق. علشان كده محتاجين نتعلم مهارة مهمة جدا اسمها مهارة التفكير النقدي أو الكريتيكال ثينكينج. تعالوا الأول نشوف إيه هي الأعراض اللي بتظهر على الشخص اللي ما بيستخدمش الكريتيكال ثينكينج في حياته. يحب دايما يسمع للناس اللي بتتفق معاه في الرأي ويتجاهل أي رأي تاني لا يتفق معاه. هتلاقيه دايما على الرغم من إن هو معلوماته محدودة إلا إنه بيحب يظهر إنه فاهم في كل حاجة. يحب يعيش نفسه جوه الأوهام وبيتنفس نظرية المؤامرة في كل شيء في حياته. هتلاقيه كمان بيصدق أي حاجة يسمعها بسهولة جدا وينشرها بمنتهى القوة. لو لقيت عندك واحدة أو أكتر من الأعراض دي فأنت محتاج تتفرج معانا على حلقات التفكير النقدي. تعالوا نشوف هنستفيد إيه لو بدأنا نستخدم أسلوب التفكير النقدي في حياتنا. مفيش حاجة في حياتنا أبيض وأسود، كلها درجات مختلفة من الجراي. استخدامك لأسلوب التفكير النقدي هيساعدك إنك توصل لأغمق درجة ممكنة من الجراي، يعني يخليك أقرب ما تكون إلى الحقيقة. اتباعك لأسلوب التفكير النقدي في حياتك هينعكس على كل نواحي حياتك الشخصية والاجتماعية والسياسية. التفكير النقدي دايما هيخلي عندك تفسيرات وأدلة تدعم بيها وجهة نظرك وقراراتك. محدش هيعرف يسيطر عليك بسهولة، هيوجهك لخدمة أهدافه، يعني عقلك هيكون ملكك أنت بس. التفكير النقدي هيكون وسيلة دفاعك ضد أي أخبار مشوهة بتنقلها وسائل الإعلام. التفكير النقدي هيعلمك تعتمد على العقل أكتر من العواطف، وبالتالي مش أي خلاف فكري يتحول إلى معركة كلامية. التفكير النقدي هيعمل منك إنسان أفضل، قادر على المساهمة بحلول مبتكرة لحل مشاكل المجتمع. التفكير النقدي مسؤولية أخلاقية عليك. التفكير النقدي واجب مش اختيار.
And that, I might add, is a very popular, this is a 2-minute distillation of a long lecture series that is very popular in Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of people have watched the series. It speaks to some kind of a demand. It speaks to the fact that these efforts are finding a receptive ear, and that there is potential. If you take stock of all of these clips that I've shared with you this evening, for liberal actors working either in cooperation with amenable states or at least not finding themselves imprisoned by those states, are able to begin to make a dent in the public discussion. Now, As we move toward winding down and eventually to taking your questions, I want to discuss with you what all of this means for the United States, for American policy toward the region. There is a formidable commitment on the part of various American institutions and some of our allies in Europe to media development work. Here in the US, we have a group like the International Center for Journalists, which is concerned with training young Arab journalists, as well as others all over the world, with the best practices of investigative reporting to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, to uncover government corruption, report on human rights abuse, to also provide technical equipment that journalists need in doing that kind of work. There are journalist advocacy groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists. And both the training and the advocacy activities have their parallels in Europe. The Deutsche Welle Academy is doing similar type of training. The BBC has a group like that as well. The underlying premise of these ventures is that the free exchange of ideas brings freedom. Now, it is undoubtedly true, the converse is undoubtedly true, that the curtailment of the free exchange of ideas is the definition of an impediment to freedom. But does the free exchange of ideas necessarily bring freedom? I will show you one more clip from the Wisal channel, that Iraqi Shiite, Iran-backed satellite channel that we saw early on this evening. And we'll talk about it, and we'll reevaluate that premise in light of it.
طلعوا له صورة مدير مكتب رويتر الإعلامي في العراق. هذا اللي هو مدير المكتب مالهم اللي اسمه ند باركر. هذا ينشر مقالات للرأي العالمي الغربي تسيء للحشد الشعبي. الرجاء رفع الشكاوى والطلب بطرده من العراق، والرجاء النشر والتعميم، هذول اللي ينشروها. هل تعرفون أن وكالة رويترز للأنباء جعلت منكم أضحوكة في الغرب؟ هل تعلمون أن وكالة رويترز للأنباء التي تعطونها مطلق الحرية والحماية للعمل في العراق تهيج الرأي العام الغربي ضد الحشد الشعبي البطل ليلا ونهارا؟ هل تعلمون أن وكالة رويترز تصور القوات العراقية والحشد الشعبي على أنهم مجموعة من السفاحين المجرمين وهم أخطر من داعش؟ والله إن كان لديكم كرامة ما أبقيتم رويترز في العراق دقيقة واحدة.
So Wajih Abbas is the talk show host who read that statement. And it was a successful little monologue because Ned Parker fled Iraq hours later in 2015. He had the good fortune to be an American citizen and had a place to flee to. But most targets of media intimidation by the media properties controlled by rogue states and trans-state actors are local voices with nowhere to run. And so one challenge to the premise that the free exchange of ideas brings freedom is that when rogue states use media to intimidate their critics, the media can itself be an impediment to freedom. So there are several problematic assumptions that many of the media development organizations based in the West regard as axiomatic. The first is that in focusing on the uncovering of, let's just say, we'll put it this way, in training their energy on investigative reporting against government abuses, which is, to be sure, a vital function in any society, and certainly in the Arab world. They are nonetheless reducing the struggle for free expression to a confrontation between free or democratic journalists and autocratic establishments, when in reality there are other challenges to free expression as well that include foreign governments like Iran, trans-state actors with their own media properties and so on, and indeed the society itself, in the sense that a traditional society can exercise its own form of organic censorship on a voice that it perceives to be divergent. And so a broadening of the spectrum of confrontation is perhaps called for. The second assumption that is problematic in Western media development programs is the difficulty in finding media to engage that is truly free. That is, if the ICFJ calls a training session in a given Arab country, who shows up? People who may, in some cases, represent themselves to be free journalists, democratic journalists, but may actually identify with a given militia or movement that is quite anti-democratic. Do you provide technical equipment to such a person? What if it's a staffer from Wisal? Is that person to be given the same advantages that a liberally minded public voice should grant? That's another question that needs to be asked, and it's an especially important one in light of some of the choices that some of the Western institutions have made. I'll give you one example. Rust. It's an online news service, extraordinarily popular, that was launched in Egypt with support from Deutsche Welle Academy. And when several of its principals were arrested by the Sisi government and probably tortured, the Committee to Protect Journalists did what it knows how to do with its communiques and public advocacy campaigns to get them out of prison. Rust owes a lot to Western institutions. The problem is that Rust, if you examine its content and you look at its board, you see that it speaks in large part for a hardline faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. You see that it has been a kind of a clearinghouse whereby Brotherhood figures that are for armed activism are taking credit for terrorist operations and exhorting people to follow in the footsteps of those violent actors. They're promoting conspiracy theories. They're also attempting to denigrate their opponents, however valid some of their criticisms may be of President Sisi, in saying that, well, he's the son of a Moroccan Jewish woman, which in its cultural context is intended to be an insult. These sorts of cheap tricks of denigration and stigmatization do not encourage a democratic ethos in Egypt. They play instead to the worst traits of bigotry that have been long ingrained. So it raises the question as to whether you want to equip a group like that. Now, some may say, well, isn't everything you just said also true about Egyptian state media? Don't they incite against Islamists and call for their death? Don't they also spout conspiracy theories and, for that matter, say that the Muslim Brotherhood is a Jewish enterprise? Yes, all of that is true. But making that point and drawing that equivalency is also a kind of admission that Rust, this network, so staunchly supported by Western actors, is a kind of a mirror image of its worst opponents, and not the kind of free journalism that those institutions are meant to encourage. Another point is that if you that there is a presumption about the fourth estate, the idea that through investigative reporting, the exposure of wrongdoing will lead to its redress, that is a kind of a projection from a Western democratic environment. In a country where the central government is too weak to act, or a tyrant is capable of ignoring public opprobrium, it does not follow that the exposure of wrongdoing will lead to its redress. And if you simply expose wrongdoing and no action is taken as a result, you may have the unintended consequence of only compounding social defeatism, a feeling that nothing can be done. So again, not that it isn't vital to uncover corruption and report on human rights abuse, but if you don't also worry about how to send a message that emboldens the population, rather than inspire them to feel even more fatalistic, then you aren't necessarily moving the ball forward. So if you were to, and I'll say one more thing about this problem. When I was in Cairo a few years ago on a trip, I met with Akram Sha'ban, who is the BBC bureau chief of the BBC Arabic service in Cairo, obviously a practitioner of free journalism who enjoys a mandate to follow the story wherever it leads. And he says, you know, Joseph, a lot of Egyptians come to me and say that they wish that they could have my job, but there are so few jobs like it, and they don't want to go into state media. Akram said, I always tell them, no, go into Egyptian television, do the work, and if you only have 20% of the freedom you want, push to make it 25%. What he is saying, when you think about it, is willfully participate in the manufacture of government propaganda most of the time and become an advocate for free journalism some of the time. The thing is, that struggle, not the struggle between free journalism and unfree states, but the struggle within the unfree organizations, is the struggle of the mainstream of the media profession in the Middle East, because these are the hybrid and undemocratic media institutions that are creating the content that most people are watching. And so if you don't have a recipe to engage and support those actors, then you are not reaching the majority of Arab publics directly or indirectly. Now, if we were then to devise an alternative approach, it would be an approach that is based not on criteria which undemocratic media fail to meet, but rather by the work that they actually do. And the work that they do, if the examples that I've shown you today can be summed up, is not the reporting of fact for public use, but rather the use of facts, hopefully facts, to inculcate a set of values, political sensibilities and cultural values. And so one way to evaluate an institution is on the merits of the values that it is inculcating, and on the possibility to negotiate over those values and build on them. If you think about the media in that sense, you're going way beyond journalism, because the inculcation of values, as the comedy, the Quranic chanting competition, and some of the other programs you've seen today attest, it's not just journalism, it's also, it may be children's programming, it may be soap operas and comedies. You need to engage the spectrum of media in that sense. And you need to have a means by which to identify our partners on the ground. And a gentleman in the room asked, what is expeditionary diplomacy? I've used the term to describe the kind of work I feel that would be needed to more effectively promote liberal media in Arab countries. It is the practice of having a cadre of bicultural, bilingual people deploy to Arab countries, study the informational environment, identify liberal actors, determine their needs, and devise a plan to help them. And what you will find if you engage in that practice is that there are a lot of actors worth engaging, that some of them have been granted a space in which to act relatively safely and securely, and that they welcome outside support. So those who say, well, what about the kiss of death, the notion that international partnership discredits a local actor? No, they are prepared to stomach whatever insults or insinuations are made for the benefits of international engagement, because they prefer it over the cost of isolation. So this is a kind of a radical departure from conventional views about media development in Arab countries. And I have been sort of living this process through quite a bit of media work in the region over the past 10 years. And I wrote this book to sort of sum up the findings and boil down the argument for an audience of concerned Americans. And so thank you again for the chance to summarize it for you.
Sir, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. But my question is, can you get a job at USIOP, or could you evaluate their work as you see it from your perspective in this regard?
You mean, would they want someone like me to evaluate what they're doing, or have I done it, or what?
Would you be effective working with that kind of institution, and how do you view their effectiveness in the roles that you would like to see them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's tremendous potential for when you have a government or semi-government institution that is tasked with promoting a set of ideals which Americans embrace and which are shared by a great many actors in the region, to provide that support. I think some of the things that would be needed in order for those institutions to achieve their potential, first of all, recognition of how dynamic the landscape is, that you have to be on the ground or have people on the ground who are continuously evaluating the competitive landscape. I mean, I could have gone on to tell you about other foreign actors, not just Iran. The Russian government is extremely active in supporting its allies in media and other cultural platforms. China has some exquisite information programs in Arabic today. So you have to be ready to continuously reevaluate your strategies and plans. You have to know a lot about the people you're working with. And you have to grant the people you send overseas the latitude to adjust their plans according to the realities that they see around them. I think that when the US government deploys militarily, those sorts of principles are very much in place, where there's a certain amount of delegation of decision-making to the people who are actually in the field. Whereas when we craft our information programs, there's considerably less latitude granted to the actual implementers. I think another question that we would need to be asking more is the issue of neutrality. Some information programs are, and I've been talking around this issue today, concerned out of being abundantly careful not to take sides in any intra-Arab dispute within a given country, not to appear to be siding with one ideological group over another. And the result may be that you are convening a gathering of people, and the ones who show up might include a few liberals as well as a whole bunch of people who are working with an Iranian-owned satellite channel, or the likes of Rust that was supported by Deutsche Welle Academy. So if we were to move to a stance where we are identifying thought partners and trying to find out what we can do to help them vis-a-vis their domestic competition, I think that too would make these efforts more effective.
I also thank you for the talk and the conclusions.
Is your mic on? It is.
Is it on? Okay. I have two linguistic questions, one of which I want to praise you for your linguistics and then ask a question on this basis, and the other a bit of criticism on the linguistics. The one I praise is that you emphasize liberalism and social modernization rather than democracy, or electoral democracy. And that raises the question, should our goal be promoting electoral democracy in this era, or should it be more promoting liberalism and social modernization as the basis for possible eventual liberal democracy? The point where I find some criticism is where you adopted our own mass media's language of saying that the Islamists are conservative and that they suppress women and other such things. Now, conservatism is not the antithesis of liberalism. Illiberalism is the antithesis of liberalism. John Stuart Mill said conservatives and liberals are the two necessary polarities of a healthy society, which I think is true. If we are to describe the Muslim Brotherhood as our media do, as progressive when they are fighting against pro-Western dictatorial regimes, that is, fighting against the global right, the West, the status quo in the world, and as conservative when they are oppressing women, that is, again, fighting against what is identified as the global right, then we're not describing the Muslim Brotherhood. We're describing what our own mass media views as the enemy, which is the conservative right in the West. We need a consistent description for the illiberal forces in those lands, and I'd like to ask you which one you think is best. Is it Islamism? Is it radicalism? Is it illiberalism? Or all of those? But I think that's what needs to be consistent, not bifurcating them into totally contradictory descriptions of them while keeping the same enemy of the Western right as the real focus of what one is against. So those are my two linguistically based questions.
So to the first question, democracy versus some kind of a social liberalism that is that distances itself from demands for political participation. If you are engaging the kinds of liberal actors whose clips you've seen today, you're talking to people who have decided to strike a generational bargain with autocrats. As I alluded to earlier, they judge further democratic experiments to be likely to carry their countries in an illiberal direction, and would prefer to benefit from the stability that continuity provides, even under an autocracy, in order to gradually inculcate social values that are among the underpinnings of a functional democracy. So I'm not saying that those who are advocating for democracy or those who are insisting upon an unbridled definition of liberalism that necessarily includes political liberalism should stop doing what they're doing. But I am arguing that the systemic approach that other liberals in the region are taking is also promising, and it should not be ignored. We shouldn't just have one approach, nor should we feel bound to to implement projects only along one strategic line. We can be like other countries and try many different approaches that might even sometimes run into cross purposes and see which one works. There's an expression in Arabic, throw the fig at the wall. If it doesn't stick, at least it'll make a stain. And I'm for throwing a lot of figs at the wall. With regard to, if I called Islamists conservatives, then I misspoke. I try to avoid conflating those two terms. I use the term Islamist to refer to a political ideology informed by ideas about Islam. Not all Islamists are necessarily violent themselves. And it's possible to construct a political ideology that is quite salubrious and is informed by ideas about Islam. But the ones that I'm talking about are, in my judgment, inherently illiberal on the score of the kinds of values that the figures you've seen today are talking about, whether it be empowering women, a notion that both sects, Islamic sects, should be regarded equally in the eyes of the law, an outlook of tolerance toward the other, and so on. So that's my judgment there.
Quick.
I know that, can we have two, because this lady and Intifad have both been, so go ahead, Will, go ahead.
Thank you very much. As one who has spent 40 years working in and with media in the U.S., you can't have that discussion without talking about the disruptors of the internet. So I realize we're talking about broadcast, but what role do you see in the Middle East with social media and the internet? Actually, we call it the Berlin Wall and need to come down. So where does that come in your thinking, or how is that disruptive, even a little bit, if at all?
So social media captured the world's attention with respect to the Middle East in how remarkably effective how effectively it was used as a tool of mobilization. At that, mobilization around a negative, bringing down regimes. The 140 character tweet proved less helpful in enabling young people to debate what they wanted to build up. Because when you start to talk about a positive agenda, you need more space to articulate it, and you need the opportunity to speak at length and elaborate consistently over a period of time. And it's not as easy to use social media to do that. The other thing about social media in Arab countries, I feel that there's been too much of a focus on the power of social media to the exclusion of the power of broadcast media, in particular because so much of the Arab infosphere is populated, like its Western equivalent, with material from TV broadcasts and print. So in other words, you want to make a point in a tweet. The quickest way to do it is to tweet one of these clips, right? And so a lot of what you find on Twitter and on Facebook, as in the US, are clips from Arabic television or links to articles from Arabic publications. So the role of conventional media is very important, and it becomes significant, for example, when you're talking about clamping down on extremism, where the US has reached a point where there's a consensus about the need to shut down jihadist indoctrination via social media. What about applying the same logic, to satellite channels that are reaching a larger audience, not only indirectly via social media, but also they're reaching people who can't read and don't have access to a smartphone.
But are they streaming on the net? The broadcast is streaming
yes,
over the internet?
Yes. So to sum up this point, a lot of social media and the internet and internet-based media in Arabic is serving as an intensifier of traditional media. It is, it is serving to intensify a TV celebrity's relationship with her public by giving a chance for interactivity and so on. Not to dispute or diminish the potential for web-based independent media ventures to actually build up an organic following. And the Tahrir Academy clip about critical thinking speaks to the value of independent, highly motivated young people doing that and not waiting for a conventional broadcast to take them on. However, I'm not prepared to give up on the potential that some of these ventures dominated by Arab establishments that are allies may yet do the region some good.
Excellent presentation, and I'm surprised that no one is listening to you, because one thing I'd like to say, I mean, the Ned Parker situation, he was in my house the night before in Baghdad. And he wrote the article based on the information I gave him. So he called me and said, I'm leaving the country. And Wajih Abbas bashed me a few months ago also. Anyway, one of the biggest bad news I'd like to tell you is the US media dealing with the Middle East through specifically Al-Hurra, which started as an excellent broadcasting station, which made a huge difference, which was the leader in the Arabic media coming from the United States. Me and Bob Riley worked on it in 2003, and it was amazing success. Now it's trailing at the bottom. Nobody watches Al-Hurra, and our taxpayers' money is going down the drain, literally. Billions of dollars, $130 million, I think, a year for Al-Hurra. I met with my congresswoman, Barbara Comstock, and I told him, if you handing $100 bills to the Iraqi public, you would make much more difference, better difference than Al-Hurra. And I'm very honest about it. The reason why, if you notice, all foreign-based media broadcasting in Arabic, they started with success and they start failing and fading down. Why? Because they start to go with the politically correct within the Arab region. And Al-Hurra, when started, was broadcasting the message of freedom and democracy against a dictatorship which is brutal against its own people. This message before the Arab Spring was a very new, blunt, strong message, and it's worked very well. Al-Hurra now is basically with a lot of taste of Hezbollah ideas and Lebanese controlled, Shia Lebanese controlled media outlet, supportive of the Iraqi government. Anybody against the Iraqi government cannot appear on Al-Hurra anymore. It is a total, and it shows you how a successful project became a failure project. I applaud Deutsche Welle TV for taking al-Bashir show. So what I'm trying to say, the United States or the Western Hemisphere, the best thing they can offer is freedom, liberalism, democracy ideas. And that's what they should promote. It's very simple, and be blunt about it. Don't be shy about it. One of the things I wrote a letter to Mr. Ambassador Alvarez praising him, that he allowed for the first time for a program to criticize the idea that Al-Quds or Jerusalem is holy for the Muslims, or present an alternative idea which was not presentable in Al-Hurra a few months ago. That's what I'm trying to say. Critical thinking, present the American ideas. They have the best market. The market in the Middle East is hungry for such ideas, outside the box, outside the mainstream. Thank you.
Well, as you pointed out in mentioning Alberto Fernandez, Al-Hurra now has new leadership. I believe that he would share your critique about Al-Hurra for many years, and the reforms that he's introducing that we're going to see unfold in the coming months are meant to reestablish Al-Hurra as more of an advocacy voice for a position and a set of principles, and less a barometer of conventional wisdom in Arab countries. That is what I understand to be the case, and has begun to manifest already online through Min Zawiya Ukhra, which is publishing new rather audacious editorials. And so I think the hope is that some of that will also be transforming the content of the TV station. I'm optimistic about positive change at Al-Hurra, and obviously the months to come will determine that.
Thank you so much.